This is a review of the methodology that I teach in both faith, religion, and culture and in medical ethics. So when we're thinking about the forms of reasoning, we can divide this into two different categories. First of all, we need to decide how it is we're going to determine whether an act is good or bad. And there's two ways that we do this. The most common way, the way we think we're doing it most of the time, is through consequentialism. We're looking at the consequences of the act. This is a look before you leap kind of thing, right? If I do this thing, what's going to happen? This is what we often identify with maturity, right? Older children, the older you get, the better you get at being able to see what are the consequences down the road if I do X or Y. And are those consequences something that I want to do or not? This is making lists of pros and cons, right? Very common. This is the standard way that we think about whether I should do something or not. Deontology is the other way. This other thing that's going on here, which we're going to call deontology, it's sometimes referred to different ways. Sometimes people just call it moral reasoning, but it has to do with values. It has to do with notions of what counts as good or bad, not just because of the consequences, but the act itself. Here we're going to focus not on the consequences of the act, but on the act itself, right? So the presumption here is that some acts are intrinsically wrong. A lot of people would say it is wrong everywhere and always to kill human beings. It is wrong everywhere and always to torture innocent children. You can get a lot of agreement on that one. It's the act. You're not looking at the consequences. You're just talking about the act. And the notion here is that this act is everywhere and always wrong, no matter the situation, no matter what the consequences of doing the act. That's not the question. The issue is, can I do this thing? Or am I the kind of person that won't do this thing? Who am I? It's an issue about virtue often, right? So these are the two ways that we think about what counts as a good or bad act. And of course, again, in consequentialism, you've got to have some notion of what counts as a good consequence, which suggests you've got some deontology lurking underneath there somewhere. Whether you can identify it or not, you're presuming that some things are good and some things are not good, that the actual outcomes are good. And that has something to do with deontology. All right, once we've decided whether an act is good or bad, we now have to decide whether we're going to do it. Notice that that's distinct from trying to decide whether the act is good or bad, right? Whether I'm going to do it is a different question. So I may just be a consequentialist, pretty common. I'm going to start with consequentialism. I'm looking at the consequences. It would be a good idea to do X, Y, and Z because we're going to get good consequences. What's the greatest good for the greatest number? Now I'm going to do it. I'm going to not only figure out why this is good, but I'm going to decide I'm going to act according to this kind of reasoning, right? Politically, this is called utilitarianism. How do you get the greatest good for the greatest number? Now, let's look at the possibility of dropping the bomb on Hiroshima. Some people did say, we need to do this because this will end the war sooner. And the sooner we can end the war, the more people will stay alive. And that means the consequences of dropping this bomb are that more people will live. Therefore, we ought to do it. All right. The absolutist says, well, I can see that there might be some good consequences, but this is simply wrong, right? So usually the absolutist is operating from deontological reasons, as they would have done in the question about dropping the bomb on Hiroshima. That is to say, they would say, it's simply wrong. This is torturing innocent children, innocent adults. And therefore, because it's intrinsically wrong, I won't do it, no matter what. Now notice, I not only am using deontology to sort of determine that this act is wrong, but now I'm doing the second thing, which is to make a rule for myself, which is to say, and because it's wrong, I will never do it. I will make no exceptions to my rule here. My rule is based on my deontological assessment of this act. But as an absolutist, I'm not going to make any exceptions. Now, there are some rare occurrences where people are absolutists for consequentialist reasons, as we saw in Quill's article. Remember, he says he has a rule that only if you can only use physician-assisted suicide and never, under any circumstances, use voluntary active euthanasia, right? He has a whole bunch of reasons for this. But the reason he won't make any exceptions, particularly in those cases where you've got patients who meet all his criteria, but who are incapable of actually killing themselves, right? They can't take the medication for one reason or another, quadriplegic, and therefore they ask that someone else does it for them. He's going to say no. I know it's not fair to this person, but I refuse to make any exceptions to the rule. Now, why does he do this? He does it because he wants to get a law passed that allows for physician-assisted suicide. And he knows that people out there are fearful that voluntary active euthanasia might get out of hand. I might wind up in the hospital and get killed when I don't want to get killed. Whether that's a rational fear or not isn't the point. People vote according to their fears a lot of times, right? So he's trying to get people to vote for and allow there to be a legalization of physician-assisted suicide. And he figures that if he makes an absolute line in the sand, I will make no exceptions. This has to be set up with no exceptions possible. Even at the cost, there's going to be a consequence here, the cost of some people not getting to do what would be fair. A few people. On the other hand, the good part here is that we'll pass this law and most people will get a choice on this. And that is, therefore, a consequentialist reason for making sure that he's not going to make any kind of exceptions to his rule. But that's an unusual thing. Most of the time, when people are absolutists, they do it for deontological reasons. Now, I should say one other thing to say about absolutism is that it's often the case that absolutists begin with the presupposition that they didn't set up this circumstance. They find themselves in a difficult situation, and their thought is, look, I'm not responsible for everybody and everything. I'm responsible for the things I do or don't do. And so I didn't set this up. I'm not responsible for the situation. I'm not going to do this act because it's wrong. Boom. They don't consider themselves guilty. They consider themselves to be virtuous. I didn't compromise, right? I did not compromise. Now, the problem is that they're not taking account of whatever the consequences are for their refusing to do whatever they're refusing to do, right? So here comes the moral realist. Here's the third position. This is the person who believes there is such a thing as true moral dilemmas, real situations in which you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. You know, it's wrong to do this thing, but they're going to say, I am responsible for both sins of commission, things I do, and sins of omission, things I don't do. Even though I didn't set this up, I'm responsible if I refuse to do things that would make the situation better, right? So they're going to be stuck in a situation where they're going to say, whether am I going to drop the bomb on Hiroshima? Well, no, it's wrong, deontologically wrong. Yeah, but if you don't drop the bomb on Hiroshima, the war is going to keep going. Here's the consequentialist position, and you're going to be responsible for all those additional deaths that happen because the war goes on for a lot longer, all right? So the moral realist starts with a presumption that they're not going to be able to get out of this without being guilty. Whatever they do, they're going to be guilty. Right? Because the act is everywhere and always wrong, no matter what the situation is, no matter what the consequences are. And if they refuse to do it, they're stuck with being guilty for the consequences over here, right? So they accept that they're responsible for both sins of omission, sins of commission, things they do, things they don't do, even if they didn't set up, none of us sets up the full situation in which we're in. But they take seriously the idea that they need to do whatever is least worst in this situation. They're going to have to do something. We're going to do something that's least worst. Now notice that a consequentialist may feel very much the same way, but they're not going to believe that they were guilty. A consequentialist is going to say, look, I did the best I could. It was a bad situation, but I did the best I could. I'm not guilty. I feel bad about it. I regret about the stuff that happened, but I'm not guilty. Do you see the difference? The moral realist says, well, if it's deontologically wrong, it's deontologically wrong. Boom. Everywhere and always. All right? So now we come to the ethical principles. There are more principles than these, but these are the ones that have been used commonly in medical ethics. I'm going to run through them. And one of the issues, of course, is how you prioritize them, because sometimes you can't do them all. In euthanasia, for example, you're going to have a conflict between autonomy and do no harm, depending on how you interpret this. But many people would say that autonomy, if you have an autonomous patient who asks for this, who meets all the requirements, that's going to come up against, perhaps, a doctor's belief that they should do no harm, coming out of this Hippocratic Western medical tradition. At any rate, so the order they're in here, they could be in any order, right? So autonomy. There are a lot of side pieces to autonomy. You can think of respect for persons. There are a lot of elements that can fall into this, but focusing specifically on autonomy. Autonomy honors the belief that human beings are rationally self-determining, right? Now, we've talked a lot about reason and about how that would work. We can, in some sense, stand outside of ourselves and observe ourselves, and so we have a kind of self. We can imagine ourselves in the past. We can remember ourselves in the past and imagine what that was like, and we can imagine ourselves in the future and imagine what that would be like. And so we have this kind of self through time, and we make decisions about what we want to do because of who we understand ourselves to be, right? And so this is understood then as something that's distinctively human, a capacity that's very important and central to our own definition of ourselves, to our understanding of ourselves as human beings, as responsible human beings. And autonomy then rides on the idea, or emerges out of the idea, that we therefore have an obligation to honor this capacity, to honor the fact that people are human beings. If you don't honor this capacity, so it goes, you are not treating other people as human beings. Right? You're treating them as something less. Okay, so autonomy. Non-maleficence, or do no harm. Oldest principle in the Western medical tradition. It's central to the Western medical tradition and has for centuries been important in decisions about not allowing euthanasia. This is all changing, especially as autonomy becomes more and more important in our thinking. But do no harm it emerges out of the Hippocratic tradition, which had some specific language regarding non-euthanasia, not killing. But of course, it also has a wider application. Do no harm. First, do no harm. Make sure that whatever you're doing to your patient isn't going to leave them worse than they were before. All right, so do no harm. Beneficence is the flip side of do no harm, or non-maleficence. It means that you want to keep your patient's best interests at the forefront. How can I best benefit my patient? This is an interesting one. And again, I think people in the nursing students often talk about how important care is. The whole care ethic is related to this idea of paying attention to the relationship you have with your patient. Loyalty matters here. Beneficence has a broad application. Just distribution is another very important social principle that was not part of the Hippocratic tradition. This has to do with what's a fair distribution of limited goods, right? Who gets the kidney when there are dozens of people who will die without it? And how do we decide? It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to divide things up equally. I mean, sometimes you can't. You can't divide an organ up equally. Right? You're going to have to decide who gets it. So then you have to come up with another way to think about this. What's the fairest way? Sometimes it is that you're going to hand things out equally, but not always. All right? So those would be the four principles, and how you in fact wind up prioritizing them is going to have a lot to do with the kind of meta-ethical vision you have, your worldview, that is going to determine which of these things are more important. Nobody's saying they're not all important, but sometimes if you've got a conflict, you have to decide which one is going to be prioritized. So I mentioned this meta-ethical or worldview out of which your determination is going to flow with regard to how you're going to prioritize your principles in given situations. Where does a person's worldview come from, right? And again, why do they prioritize principles as they do when there's a conflict? So traditionally, this comes out of a religious tradition and a Christian religious tradition, Methodism actually. It's sometimes called the Wesleyan quadrilateral from John Wesley. So it began with scripture, tradition, reason, and experience, all notions that were related to the Christian tradition. But you can broaden this out, and you can use the quadrilateral in a much broader context, right? You can think about this from the perspective of being a Buddhist or a Muslim or whatever, right? So what is the revelatory source for a given religion that becomes the ultimately important place where you get what's really true? What's morally true? How do I know what's morally true? Scripture or the revelatory source that's important. I should say, in many ways, I think you could argue that for the Enlightenment tradition, reason itself becomes the revelatory source. But that's another conversation. Nevertheless, I think we can think about the Enlightenment as a tradition in the way we think about Christianity as a tradition or Buddhism as a tradition. It has its own revelatory source. So you're going to have a tradition. Now, tradition doesn't mean any tradition, like every Christmas we put up Christmas trees or, well, maybe that is sort of related, but traditions, I don't know, at some colleges they throw their caps in the air. That's a tradition, right? But this kind of tradition, at least historically, when it was initially implied, it had to do with the church. What is the community that's developed around the revelatory source that holds that source as the most authoritative voice? And then the question is, the tradition is all the things that emerge out of that. So the communities gathered around this particular source, and in some ways what they have to do, what we all have to do, is then make sense of our lives and of the situation we're in, and you try and interpret what you learn from your revelatory source and apply it to particular situations, right, that you're in. And a whole community that does this together. You're going to talk about this together. Some traditions do this from the top down. You've got theologians in the Catholic Church, for example, who pay a lot of attention to what does the church teach about what's true about God, and therefore, because this is what's true about God, we think that this is how we ought to act in the world. So truth moves from what's true about God to what's true about ethics, what's true about morality. And so this is where you're deriving, you're finding this, what's true here, what's morally true. And again, be careful not to just think of tradition as any old tradition. It's related, when you're thinking of the quadrilateral, it's related. It's the community that authorizes a particular source and then has a history of having interpreted that source in particular kinds of social situations. All right, so these first two, tradition and scripture, or tradition and reason, or the revelatory source and whatever that tradition is that's built around it, are going to be particularist. They're going to deal with particular communities. They're going to be different, right? Buddhists are going to make some decisions over here. Catholics are going to make decisions over here. I don't know. Different people are going to make different kinds of decisions from different traditions that are built around or derived from some revelatory source. So we're not going to get agreement necessarily across different traditions. The bottom two, theoretically, ought to be common. We ought to be able to share these. The notion here is that these are all things we can make sense of together as human beings, not as particularly a Christian or a Buddhist or whatever you are. The quadrant that's reason, that includes empirical data. That's a very important part of this, is where you take scientific evidence into account. This was very important in the church's debates around same-sex unions. And many religious traditions now have decided that the sexual orientation is not a moral issue. Now, they may decide that whether you act on that or not is a moral issue. But again, because of what we now know about how sexual orientation functions, where it comes from, we're not totally sure, but we know a lot more about it than we used to. This has changed. This has been brought in. So the tradition is now taking account of this in some places, not everywhere, but in many places, right? Another thing that fits in under reason is this whole discussion of natural law or the law of nature. Remember the 2 videos we watched from C.S. Lewis, right? Remember that his argument, what he wanted to say was, if you watch people argue, it means that they must have some shared presuppositions about what counts as fair. Every time you say something's fair or not fair, you're making universal claims, right? And every time he wants to say, people start to get into arguments about, did you do this? Did you do that? Were you good? Were you bad? Are you guilty? People rarely will say, well, I just don't think that it matters. They'll say, I didn't do X. That's a very interesting thing, right? Something that C.S. Lewis has really spent a lot of time thinking about. But it suggests that we've got shared ideas here about what counts as good. We may then, remember Shantung compound, people can rationalize their decisions. We want to be good people, so we'll come up with all sorts of reasons why why it was fair for me to take 7 parcels, Red Cross parcels, and not give any to anybody else. But that was fair because I'm an American and they were for Americans, and however you're going to set this up. But lots of rationalizations to justify the fairness of my decision to do X or Y based on the presupposition that good people do fair things and fair things look kind of the same. That I'm not being selfish. I'm just going by the law here. The law says these are for Americans, and so they ought to go to Americans, even if the Americans get 7 and the Brits get none, right? So that kind of discussion, it all fits in under the reason quadrant. Natural law also is, we arrive often at decisions about what we should do, what we socially believe we ought to do, that we think that are really truly good decisions. Because what we're really looking at is what makes us flourish. And so the presumption there is what makes us flourish as human beings or as a global community, those things are good because flourishing is presumably good. Now, you're not really getting down behind why is flourishing good? That would be the deeper question. But we can go a long way in society at coming up with moral agreements by making arguments with each other where we bring data in and we sort of say, well, look, if you remove children from the home at the age of 2 for this reason, or this reason, or this reason, these are going to be the costs. And this is going to be terrible for this child. Or maybe it'll be better for this child because somebody else over here is going to say, well, no, we have an obligation to the children to take them away from their parents in some states. So you're going to get those kinds of debates going. But the very fact that we debate about this means that what we're saying is we all want to arrive at the best possible way of moving forward on some particular issue, such that it helps everything to flourish, right? We want to have flourishing happen. So those are the kinds of debates that go on. This requires observation and then some kind of rational analysis. Now, experience is its own kind of thing. Experience is related to the other 3, right? When you look at whatever your revelatory source is, you're looking through some lenses here, the lens of my own experience. When I think about my tradition, when I reason about something, it's coming through me, right? So experience is always in play. But at least in the way we're using it in this class, normally what we'll think about is experience here, particularly as related to euthanasia, is going to have to do with things like, have you ever worked in a nursing home? And what did you see there? What kind of suffering did you observe? What did you hear from patients? Maybe you have a grandparent who died a slow and difficult death. But maybe this grandparent said, no, I'm going to wait for God's time. I'm not going to push things. I'm going to trust God. Now, that's an experience that can have a profound effect on children in the same family if they observe this, right? So those kinds of experiences are going to be specifically applicable, especially when you're thinking about, why do I think this or why do I think that? All right? So then how can we use these methodological tools to analyze the articles that you're reading and also then eventually to analyze your own moral position on euthanasia? Remember what we did for Quill, right? The first question you want to ask when you're reading these articles is, what is this person arguing in favor of? Quill's clearly arguing in favor of physician-assisted suicide. He makes it clear that he thinks doctors should have the capacity to do more, that they shouldn't be forced into either lying and acting against the law, or that he wants them to be able to accompany their patients through their suffering and into death if the patients ask for it. He talks about the suffering of patients in the beginning, right? But it's one of the reasons that he wants to emphasize physician-assisted suicide and to reject euthanasia, active voluntary euthanasia, is, as I said before, it's to protect people from the fear that someone else is going to do this to them. And he wants to get this passed. But he talks about the difference in power between the patient and the doctor, right? So notice that he's already talking about protecting autonomy here, protecting the patient's ability to choose. He doesn't want them to be subtly coerced. And so we know right off the bat that he's interested in autonomy. As you think about it, you have to look at the arguments he's actually making. In his case, it's pretty clear. The minute he sets up his criteria, you can see that the criteria are all shaped around the idea of protecting rationality. He's not just saying it's your body, therefore you have a right to choose. He wants to make sure that the patients are making rational decisions, right? This is what he wants to defend here, because he thinks that this is what honors their humanity. So autonomy becomes clear. He doesn't mention the Enlightenment. You have to know about that. I've talked about it in class, but you can be pretty clear that when people emphasize autonomy, especially when they're, he talks there's the end section of the article where he talks about how offensive death is, how offensive it is, existentially unacceptable. That this is a pretty clear case of somebody who's not comfortable at all with accepting limits. The reason he sees as a kind of unlimited capacity, and he sees that this built-in offense, that reason is limited by our natural physical bodies. So all of these things point towards the Enlightenment tradition for Quill. And Mailander, of course, as you know from class, is coming out of a very different tradition. Right off the bat, his article is called A Christian Vision in regard to euthanasia, right? So or mercy killing. So he goes through a number of arguments, but from the very beginning, he talks about the book, he's talking clearly to Christians here, and he's talking to Christians who he thinks have made a mistake by being moved so much by compassion that they're unwilling to accept the idea that they're also aiming at death. He wants to distinguish the deontological issue of death, I think, as an act itself. It has its own valence. It's important that people act with compassion, but compassion does not override the limits that he believes are set by God. I think it's pretty clear here that he is arguing for, if you ask what he's trying to protect, always a good question to ask. What's he trying to protect? He wants to protect the Christian tradition, I think. And pastorally speaking, he wants to protect the faith of people, of Christians who he thinks have made a mistake, that they're not getting enough good advice. So he's speaking here as a theologian of the church, but also as a pastor, right? So it's pretty easy to figure out where these guys are going. Now, it's not quite as clear if you're working with Lisa Cahill. That's trickier. She's working out of a Christian background, a Christian perspective. The reason I have that next to the one from the Pope is because she's providing a kind of an alternative view of mercy killing from the perspective of somebody who understands themselves as a Christian, right? So she's also working out of the Christian tradition. If you're somebody who is not interested in religion, and you are interested in emphasizing autonomy, don't use Mailander or the Pope's article to argue against your position, because clearly they're starting from a different worldview than you are. So that's not going to challenge you. Ringel is a better article for you to use there. Ringel seems to be a humanist. It's not clear what his full background is, but he's clearly a humanitarian, a humanist. And he's also an absolutist against mercy killing, or at least against suicide. It's a different setup. He's talking here about suicide and suicide prevention. He's not talking specifically about euthanasia, but I think that much of what he says here is applicable. So what you want to do, there is a worksheet for the articles, and I think, you're always going to want to start by saying, what is this author arguing in favor of? What are they protecting? What's important to them? What is it that they want to protect? What is it they're afraid of? Those are always good issues, because it'll help you to figure out what tradition they're coming out of. What is being lifted up here in these articles as the great good that needs to be protected. That will help you find which of the principles is most important here. So how do you begin this paper? How do you begin to sort out your own convictions and commitments? I think the easiest way to do this is to read the articles and pay attention to the arguments you like and the ones you don't like. Now, there may be some articles that you generally don't agree with, but there may be some issues raised within the article that you find interesting and persuasive. Make sure you hold on to those, mark them so you can go back to them, so you can take them into account in your own assessment of your position. As you're working through the imaginary situation that I'm asking you to set up in part 1, pay attention to your first and second and perhaps third responses. Remember, you're to imagine that someone that you're close to has asked you for your help in killing themselves. Now, that's obviously not a comfortable or nothing any of us would like to have to do, but I'm trying to get you to see what your responses are to this, what your immediate reactions are. What is it that moves you the most? Is it your concern about compassion? Is it your concern about honoring their autonomy? Is it your concern about being faithful? Is it your concern about doing the right thing? And how would you determine what the right thing is? Right? Again, using other articles will help you to sort that out. That will give you material to work with. You can begin to press those immediate responses as you move into the second section of the paper. Again, if you're having trouble, I'm perfectly happy to meet with you, to do a Google Hangout with you. So just let me know if you would like to meet. Sometimes it's really helpful to just talk this through with other people. So talk about it with family and friends as well, and just see where you get to. My cat's trying to enter the picture here. All right, good luck. Let me know if you have trouble.